With the declaration, "Let justice be done though the heavens may fall," a conservative judge changed the world and created a beacon of freedom to people everywhere, because there was now the sure and certain knowledge that when any person, no matter what their station, set foot on this land, they were free. This land was England. The year was 1772, and the case that ended slavery in the British Empire involved this man, James Somerset, and his master, who had sailed from Boston to London. Nearly 100 years before President Lincoln freed those held in bondage in America, Great Britain freed the slaves through legal precedent. The amazing and moving story of the landmark trial that led to the end of human slavery. The scene may be familiar to single moms everywhere. A life that seems a bit too busy, too complicated, and too confusing. It's a scene from More Sex and the Single Mom. We talked to Gail O'Grady about sex, being single, and being a mom.
My son is 8 months old, so I will have a few years to, have this conversation with him.
It's Boston's favorite murder scene, sheer madness.
25 years ago, this very night,
Sarah Edwards gives a new tint to the serial killing salon. All that and more tonight on Nitebeat.
Now, live from CN8, the Comcast network, this is Nitebeat with Barry Nolan.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Approximately 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. It is sometimes called the war between the states. Some people in the red states like to call it the war of northern aggression, but it was really the war over slavery. Besides those differences over tax and trade policy that will always exist between urban and agrarian areas, the reason for the war was, without question, slavery. The South believed without slave labor, their economy, their way of life would collapse. And so they fought a war against the industrialized North, which totally decimated their economy and their way of life, and they lost, and slavery was ended. In Great Britain, slavery was ended by a different route. The number of casualties in the battle to free the slaves in the British Empire, 0. The story of how this happened is fascinating, involving a young man who was kidnapped into slavery at the age of 8, an American merchant with Boston connections, and a no-nonsense conservative judge. It's a story about black history you don't hear much about in the history books. But the story is told in rich detail in this book, Though the Heavens May Fall, by Stephen Wise. He joins us tonight. Welcome, Mr. Wise.
Thank you for inviting me.
Terrifically well-researched and written book, and I find it fascinating that you come to it from a background in litigation about animal rights.
Yes, I've been an animal rights lawyer for more than 20 years, and as I began to think about how is it that a non-human animal might move, say a chimpanzee, from being a legal thing to being a person with rights, I began to think, well, how did humans who didn't have rights begin to move from that place, from being a thing with no rights to a person with rights? And that drew me straight to the case of James Somerset.
So this was a man, James Somerset was a young man that was kidnapped from someplace in Africa at the age of 8.
Yes.
Brought over, as you put it, perhaps seasoned in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and then he ends up with his master. Explain the...
Yes, his master, who came from Scotland, purchased him in Virginia, and over the next 20 years they lived together and became actually close. They then moved to Boston and were here for 4 or 5 years, and then his master, Stuart, took Somerset to London, and even though they had been together for 22 years, it turns out that James Somerset wanted to be free, and the first chance he got in London, it took him 2 years, he left. He escaped, and he went into this kind of teeming mass of freed and escaped slaves in London.
You have this great description of London back then, a city of 800,000 souls, chaotic, compact, crowded, cruel, dangerous, dark, dirty, diseased, squalid, stinking, and violent, a twisting maze of alleyways and courtyards. Even to be in that, though, and be free was better.
He wanted to be free, even if the part of London he was in was even the worst part of that London.
You also mentioned the fact that historically in Great Britain, slavery went way back to the Anglo-Saxons. Back early documents around the year 1000, Christians captured other Christians and sold them. The Vikings came down and captured people, and they sold people off to the Germans and the Danes, and it was a pretty rough go of it for a lot of people.
Yes. Well, it began slowly to end with people suing, and indeed this was the case where for the first time an abolitionist named Granville Sharp, who believed, like many others before him, that slavery was wrong, decided to do something about it. And this was a man who was iron-willed, and he decided that he didn't care whether everyone in the country thought that slavery was right. He thought it was wrong, and by God, he was going to make it illegal and force the greatest judge in the land, Lord Mansfield, to make it illegal, and he did.
And what is one of the interesting things is people at the time, I came across a quote by John Locke, who reasoned that slavery was one of the worst evils on earth, but he had slaves. Black slaves didn't count.
No, and that's the thing about being a slave. Whether you're a human slave or a non-human slave, you are invisible. Only legal persons count. Legal things, whether it's chairs and tables or black slaves or chimpanzees today.
Is that why in the law when somebody is charged with murder, they say that so-and-so is charged with murdering Jane Doe, a human being, on January 25th?
Yes. Murder is the killing of a human being.
So James Somerset had run away. He had found some place to hide for a while in this warren that was London. And slave catchers catch up with him, and they're going to send him to Jamaica, which is almost certain death, because people don't realize slaves were treated differently in the Caribbean.
They were treated horribly. The lifespan of James Somerset would have been perhaps 4 or 5 years, and he would have had a pretty terrible, hot, miserable life there. And instead, friends of his, or perhaps his godparents, we don't know for sure who they were, got a writ of habeas corpus, which is similar to what, for example, the people who are in Guantanamo Bay now are trying to do. They're trying to get a writ of habeas corpus, means produce the body. I'm telling you, you have the body, whether it's a black slave or the people in Guantanamo, produce the body before a court and justify what gives you the right to hold them. And that's what happened to James Somerset. The people who were holding him, the captain of the slave ship, were forced to come into court, and there began one of the most remarkable cases that have ever been heard in English.
What was the thrust? What, if the brief were reduced to a couple of sentences, what was the argument that this man, who was a piece of property in the eyes of the slave owner, Charles Stewart, an unfortunate name here in Boston, Charles Stewart was his property, how could you reason that this property right no longer existed?
Well, the case went on for 6 months, and there were many, many arguments, and for its time, there was an extraordinary number of lawyers. There were actually 7 lawyers involved, and usually at the time, no lawyers were involved in courtrooms. But the argument that really seemed to persuade the judges was that under Virginia law, James Somerset was a slave, and normally he would be seen as a slave in England as well, but English law would not recognize his slavehood if it was seen as being something that the common law just couldn't abide. Was it completely immoral to have a slave? And that was the argument that was made, and indeed Lord Mansfield finally said in his decision in June of 1772 that slavery was so odious, and he used the word odious, that the common law would never abide it, and therefore he ordered James Somerset discharged.
And this at the time when the equivalent of corporate lawyers were there saying, you can't do this because it would be so disruptive to the economy, that people that have invested in slaves and have thought they were playing by the rules would be ruined.
Yes, and sometimes you think it was almost a miracle that that argument did not carry the day, because a judge like Lord Mansfield was a deeply conservative judge. He
Very respectful of property rights.
Very much so, and English property rights especially. He virtually invented modern commercial law, modern insurance law, maritime law. He was a very large backer of British mercantile interests, and it was quite a risk to bring this case before him and try to force him into ruling that slavery was illegal in England.
So, as you look at this as a lawyer, is there any thought that it could have been different in America? Instead of those 650,000 deaths in the Civil War, could somebody possibly have brought action at some point and said, all right, you say you own this, show me a good title. Just like you have to produce a title for a piece of land that shows the person that sold you this had the right to sell it to you. Show me the title for this man.
Well, you know, just as the James Somerset case really stopped slavery in England and was very important, there was another slave case in the U.S. that was just as important, and that was the Dred Scott case. And in that, the United States
That was the runaway slave case.
It was the question as to whether Dred Scott was a citizen under the United States. And the very much pro-slavery Southern Supreme Court at the time in the 1850s ruled the other way from Lord Mansfield. And they said that a black person had no rights that a white person was bound to respect. And people like Abraham Lincoln were so infuriated by that he never paid attention to what the Supreme Court ever said again till the end of his life. And so our judicial system was used to prop up slavery, while the British judicial system was used to destroy it.
Every high school or college student in the country should read this book, Though the Heavens May Fall, Let Justice Be Done, by Stephen Wise, the landmark trial that led to the end of human slavery. Thank you, Mr. Wise, so much for stopping by.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Now, Wise will be speaking and signing his book on Thursday, February 24th, at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge at 6:30. It is a fascinating subject. Now, you may have heard there is kind of a big game this weekend. I think it's called the Soup Bowl something.